Hello, my name is Quasi Edwards, and I'm a member of the go-to-market team at AWS, focusing on database migrations. I've been at AWS for almost 5 years now, helping customers migrate their commercial engine databases over to AWS or breaking free from those commercial engine databases. Many organizations want to consider a cloud strategy for their mission-critical Oracle workloads. However, licensing has been a big concern for them. There's a lot of confusion in the market. So today we'll be discussing optimizing your Oracle licenses on AWS. Customers often ask about ways to optimize those licenses and potentially reduce their overall spend. So in this session, we will cover that. Today, I'm joined by our premier partner, House of Brick Technologies, and Nick Walter is a principal architect and cloud practice lead there. As far as agenda goes, we'll be talking a little bit about Oracle products and licensing, just to set a baseline, the different ways to run your Oracle workloads on AWS, contractual licensing principles, and finally, strategies for optimizing those licenses on AWS. Oracle has a wide variety of products, probably most well known for their relational database, but they also have Fusion middleware for application development and deployment, business intelligence for reporting, as well as a variety of Oracle applications, ERP, CRM, and cloud applications, some of which they developed themselves like eBusiness Suite, and some came through acquisition like PeopleSoft, Siebel, and JD Edwards. From a licensing perspective, their core technology, their database, their middleware, and their BI are licensed either by processor or computing unit or by named users, number of users that can access the system. The applications, however, are licensed via an application user license. When we get to the database level, at Standard Edition, either it's Standard Edition 1, or Standard Edition 2, it's actually licensed by socket, whereas Enterprise Edition is licensed by core. If you're using Oracle today, you're probably very familiar with these concepts, but we want to lay the foundation for ways to optimize these options moving forward on AWS. Let's talk a little bit about ways to run Oracle on AWS. The first and most common way is to run self-managed, where you take the databases as you're running them today and run on our different compute systems, either the Elastic Compute Cloud, we call EC2, or our VMC, our VMware Cloud. You are doing all the same things that you were doing on-premise. You were patching, provisioning, doing the upgrades and all those things, but taking advantage of the scale of the compute capabilities at AWS. The other option you do have is to have a managed database, where AWS provides a solution called RDS, the Relational Database Service, where we provide the patching and provisioning and the undifferentiated heavy lifting associated with managing the database. So you could focus on the high value aspects of the database to make sure that it meets your performance needs and the application areas of the database. From a licensing perspective, you could either bring your own license to it if you happen to own Oracle licenses, or there's a license included model that works with our Standard Edition and Standard Edition 2, where you can rent the licenses as part of the service. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nick to talk a little bit more about Oracle contractual licensing principles.
Thank you, Quasi. Just again, this is Nick Walter with House of Brick Technologies. I'm the principal architect and cloud practice lead. For those of you watching this who've never heard of House of Brick Technologies, we've been around for over 20 years. We're currently part of the OpsCompass family of companies. We're an Amazon and VMware partner, and we offer consulting services that are really focused towards what we call business critical systems, which usually translates to business critical relational databases or business critical back office enterprise application stacks. architecture services, migration services, license services. We have a whole portfolio of services around helping people move their business-critical applications to the places they need them to be. And of course, in the last few years, that has really focused on helping people move their solutions into the cloud, an area in which we have quite a bit of experience. One thing we've heard from a lot of our customers, and I think this quote from VMworld from Kareem Semmer really sums it up, that everyone thinks about the technicals when moving to the cloud, and where you actually get trapped, where the gotchas are, is that the licensing models, especially on legacy contracts for software products that different companies might own, those older legacy contracts probably were written pre-cloud or are using boilerplate language from a pre-cloud era, which creates a lot of confusion and difficulties in terms of migrating those applications effectively to the cloud without falling into some sort of licensing trap or falling afoul of a vendor that is going to, software audit you and create a situation where you have some unexpected software bills for the licenses. And House of Brick has a very long experience in Oracle licensing. As I said, we've been doing Oracle for over 20 years. And we always like to lead with this, because this sentence, this highlighted sentence here, is sort of the key definition. This has been part of the boilerplate Oracle licensing agreements for over 15 years, as far as I'm aware. And it always has the same simple sentence in it. And I'm going to read it to emphasize it. Processors shall be defined as all processors where the Oracle programs are installed and or running. Now, of course, as an engineer, we know that programs aren't installed on processors, but leaving that kind of linguistic oddity aside, I think it's a pretty clear-cut sentence. So I want to reemphasize that there's lots of ways to look at Oracle licensing, and it can be a very confusing area when you start getting into high availability or DR. But at the end of the day, you need to pay attention to the places where Oracle is installed, as in the binaries are present, it could run, or it is actually running. Those are the places of concern when licensing Oracle. The next thing to understand is that expanding from that one sentence that I just read out into the whole vast, dizzying array of documentation that Oracle makes available to their customers is which documents are binding contractually, in the sense that you either signed an agreement when you purchased your Oracle products or when you signed your master services agreement with them that says these documents are binding, or they're included by direct reference in those contractual documents that you signed. Because there's a lot of documents out there that Oracle's put out there just to help interpret things or to give you their opinion. And those are interesting documents, but not necessarily ones that are binding on you. This list on this slide is not comprehensive. There are more documents out there, but these are the ones that we see people asking us about the most. So we kind of divided them into the top and bottom half here. So the technical support policies, the processor core factor, or any amendments to your contract that are in the ordering documents that you accepted and paid, anything in there is contractual. You have to pay attention to it. You have to obey it. Those are contractual rules that govern your uses of the software licenses that you've got from Oracle. There's some other stuff in there that might be interesting to read, software investment guide, licensing data recovery guide, et cetera, that, help you understand how Oracle thinks about these things. But if you find something in one of those documents and you're kind of scratching your head saying, that doesn't make sense, or that's not how I think this should work, go check your contractual documents. If there's nothing there backing it up, it might be a point that's open to interpretation or to discussion with Oracle. And as always, whenever you're dealing with a contractual issue, I'll throw in the mandatory disclaimer now. House of Brick is not a law firm. We're not your legal advisors. Run this through your legal if things are getting a little contentious, because their opinion is the one that's going to be most important to you. All that being said, there's a lot of complexity on the edge cases of Oracle licensing, but most of it's pretty straightforward. I know it has a reputation as a confusing area to work in, but if you follow some simple rules, you can get through most of it pretty quickly. When you're licensing Oracle, as Kwesi indicated earlier, by processor or by compute unit, which is by far the most popular way for the core technology products, the databases and so forth, you just simply count all cores where Oracle is installed and or running. In a virtualized environment such as the Amazon public cloud, it can be sometimes a little bit difficult to figure out which physical computers and how many cores are in play, but that is the traditional contractual licensing metric that one should pay attention to. There is nothing in your contract about licensing by virtual CPU. In the contractual documents between your enterprise and Oracle, there is reference to physical processors. So to do things by that contractual metric, you need to be able to trace down to the physical processor. Now, I know that's an extremely difficult thing to do in the cloud. Don't worry, we're going to talk about how that's done. Oracle realized years ago that it would be very, very difficult for people to call up Amazon and say, hey, I have these 15 EC2 instances with Oracle software installed. Would you please tell me exactly which physical host it's on so I know where my licenses are assigned? There's all sorts of operational and logistical difficulties with that. So Oracle published this policy. There's a link to it on this slide, which we kind of colloquially call their cloud licensing policy, but it's actually called the Authorized Cloud Environment Policy. And what this policy says is Oracle is okay with you licensing by vCPU if you follow these special rules, and they're all in the policy. Now, what's interesting about those special rules, or about that entire document, is that it is, in fact, a non-contractual document. It contradicts what is in your contracts with Oracle and makes, it doesn't directly contradict, but it makes grants that the contract has no mention of. So, from House of Bricks' perspective, it is a fairly reliable policy in the sense that, in our experience helping clients with audits and in interacting with Oracle that way, Oracle has never shown any signs that they're going to give anybody trouble over using this policy. They say this is the policy, and if people say during audit we're following the policy, then all is well. However, because it is non-contractual, Oracle can amend it whenever they like. And they have done so. Most recently in January of 2018, but there was a few years there where it was being updated every year with less and less customer-friendly terms, shall we say. So it is important to keep an eyeball on this and make sure that it's not moving on you if you are relying on it for your business. When you're using the cloud policy, you're going to count virtual CPUs instead of physical cores. You no longer care about the underlying physical cores. However, you have lost the ability to apply what Oracle calls the processor core factor, which is a price multiplier based on the style of physical core. And generally, Intel family processors on the x86 architecture were very price-friendly in that regard. So the cloud policy licensing instead says count vCPUs, and there's no core factor type ratio to be applied, just count up to figure out how many processor licenses you're using. And it's very simple. In Amazon, with hyperthreading enabled, which is the default for EC2 and RDS unless you've taken extra steps to disable hyperthreading, then every 2 virtual CPUs is 1 processor license. If you've disabled hyperthreading, then 1 vCPU equals 1 processor license. I'm sure all the engineers listening to this are saying, well, that's pretty straightforward. 1 vCPU with hyperthreading disabled equates to 1 physical core. So I'm paying 1 processor license per physical core. 2 vCPUs with hyperthreading enabled on an x86 architecture equals 1 core. So I'm still paying 1 processor license per 1 processor core that's underlying my workload. And that would be the correct math. Where a lot of people get hung up on this is that if you look at the prices and the core factors for on-premises deployments on dedicated owned servers, not on the cloud policy, but on the traditional processor licensing, then you can get 2 cores of x86 for 1 license. So this cloud policy ratio seems to be a little unfavorable, and that's true. It is a little unfavorable. Oracle likes to market that as it's double your cost to take x86 workloads into AWS. That is generally not true. Because databases are rarely CPU constrained, and I won't go into the full engineering on that because it's a topic near and dear to my heart that I could talk on for quite a long time. But in House of Bricks experience, when we move customers from on-premises environments into Amazon RDS or Amazon EC2 with their Oracle software deployments, generally there is either no uplift because we were able to consolidate workloads into less vCPUs, or only a very slight uplift. We've even had a few occasions where we were able to save people some money by consolidating workloads and using less vCPUs in the cloud and less licenses. When you come to the cloud, if you have just traditional processor licenses, it's pretty straightforward. But there are a lot of options. You might have an unlimited license agreement. You might be looking at RDS or EC2, maybe the VMware Cloud and AWS. Maybe you're looking at dedicated hosts or bare metal instances. That can get a little confusing, but remember the same licensing principles are going to apply. And I'm going to start on the right side of that chart. If you have an unlimited license agreement, you're in pretty darn good shape because you don't have to count cores at all. That should not be taken as an endorsement of unlimited license amendments from Oracle because they tend to be very, very expensive. But if your company already has one, obviously it gives you quite a bit of freedom to deploy your Oracle's solutions into AWS in any fashion you like. If you want to do traditional core-based licensing and not use the cloud policy, a lot of people don't realize this, but you can do that in AWS. You just need to have dedicated servers where you can point to servers and say, I'm using this server, it is for my workloads, and I know how many processors are in it, so I can count the processors and license it via traditional metrics based on physical processors. To do that, you need a cloud solution that offers you a whole host, and there are plentiful options for that. You could use dedicated hosts in EC2 or bare metal instances, which from a licensing perspective are nearly the same thing. The technicals differ. You can also use the VMware Cloud and AWS, which again is a solution built on dedicated EC2 hosts. If you want to use RDS or EC2, you have the option, obviously, of using the cloud policy and just counting the vCPUs. And then there's a really intriguing option available only in RDS, which is, as Kwesi already spoke to, the ability to rent a license from Amazon, the standard edition license included bundle, where you simply pay as you use. That can be a really big money saver and help optimize the cost model of your Oracle usage to make it in line with the usage model that you're probably familiar with from any other public cloud service, where it's pay as you use, and if you decide you're done with it, you're done with it. That can be a very refreshing change from Oracle software licensing, where you have to purchase the license and then pay an expensive support and maintenance fee every year to keep that license active and supported. With the license included, you can just use it for a few months and then you're done, and that's the end of that. No follow-up needed. Okay. Let's talk about how we're going to optimize our licenses in AWS, because as I alluded to earlier, it's very important to avoid getting penalized by that cloud licensing policy or by any physical licensing, physical processor, traditional licensing metrics. It's important to keep in mind that CPU is the metric that drives your license. But for most databases, I/O or memory are more scarce resources. So you have a couple ways to tackle that so that you're using very few licenses but still getting highly performant workloads in AWS. The obvious one is reduce vCPU. You can trim the number of vCPUs by choosing EC2 or RDS instance shapes that aren't overcommitting the amount of vCPU above what you need. And that can actually make a very dramatic difference in licensing costs over time. Next option, if you have enough workloads to justify it, would be using something like dedicated hosts or bare metal hosts, where you have an entire physical server that you can license by traditional metrics and avoid the cloud policy entirely. Very attractive ways to save money on Oracle licensing if you do that. Furthermore, you can just reduce the overall number of cores that are in play by consolidating workloads as much as possible. Now, this is obviously a strategy that is going to be attractive if you're doing the physical CPU licensing. The traditional licensing is how I like to refer to that, where you can consolidate databases onto one EC2 server, or if you're doing an EC2 dedicated host, you can just license the server and then run a number of isolated different virtual machines, in EC2 terms, instances on that physical host. But because you've licensed the physical host, every EC2 instance on it is fully licensed for whatever that Oracle product is. So that could be a great way to consolidate workloads. Reducing feature usage is another really interesting one that people tend to overlook. The Oracle pricing model is based on Oracle Standard Edition database being relatively inexpensive, Oracle Enterprise Edition database being much more expensive, and then all of the additional options and packs that you can purchase for Oracle Database Enterprise Edition, layering more and more costs on. If you can look at those things and find ways in Amazon to remove them because you don't need them, there's great cost savings. It's possible. A classic example is Oracle Real Application Clusters. Oracle RAC is a very popular product in enterprise deployments and in on-premises environments because it provides high availability out of dedicated physical servers. It provides the clustering technologies and the failover and so forth. When you're in a public cloud environment where some of those features are just automatically there for any workload in a virtual cloud instance, maybe you don't need Oracle Real Application Clusters anymore, and there's a potential to save some money. And then, of course, the ultimate way to save on Oracle costs is to simply migrate your database solution stack out of an Oracle commercial database and into an open source engine. That takes a little bit of work, obviously. I don't want to mislead anybody into thinking that's just as easy as telling the DBAs to go spend a couple days doing it. It is tricky to do, but can have very big long-term savings from getting rid of expensive commercial support payments for commercial database licenses. So when you look at these areas, you want to look at how to optimize them, and you approach it differently based on whether you're looking at vCPU licensing or hardware licensing. If you're in the world of vCPU licensing, you want to use a couple different Amazon-specific options. So the standard edition license included is, as I mentioned earlier, a fantastic deal, especially for transient workloads. So let's say non-production databases for developers, testers, quality assurance, staging, whatever, where you just want to spin them up, use them for a project for a week or two, or maybe even a month, and then destroy them. Having to manage an inventory of Oracle licenses to enable that on your own paper would be very difficult, time-consuming, and potentially expensive, whereas using the Amazon feature to just pay Amazon a little bit extra to cover the Oracle license while you're using it, and then stop when you're done, is very attractive. There's another feature here I'm not going to talk about because I know Kwesi's going to talk some more about it. There's a feature called Optimized CPU that lets you determine the exact number of vCPUs you want available, and that obviously is a great way to optimize your license usage to just the minimum number of CPUs needed. Pre-migration right sizing is exactly what the name implies, which is making sure that you've consolidated or shrunk workloads that have maybe sprawled over time because they just had a really huge server on premises and never needed to get more optimized than that. And on the hardware licensing side, there's a few more points there that I think I've already spoken to, but you'll want to focus on them. which is cutting your feature usage or looking at database freedom. So with all these strategies in mind, there's a lot of ways to bring your Oracle workloads into AWS very, very cost effectively. Now, I know I spoke to a lot of really interesting features there. Kwesi, do you want to go into some more detail on some of these RDS features?
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate that. So as Nick mentioned, one strategy for reducing Oracle licenses is changing the edition. Customers have shared with us that one of the reasons that they can't move to standard edition is high availability. All RDS engines support something called multi-AZ, or multiple availability zone. This feature allows a database to be set up with a standby in another availability zone. That instance is only active in the unlikely event of the production instance going down. The database endpoint is moved seamlessly to the standby database, making it completely seamless and transparent to your applications. This capability can be used in both license included as well as BYOL. You do have to license the standby database per Oracle's policy, but you don't need Enterprise Edition or Active Data Guard or any of the other additional features and options that Oracle provides there. The next area that people talk about needing is security. AWS provides KMS, our key management service, which provides encryption at rest. It's available on your EBS storage volumes, which are the things that RDS leverages, but you can also run them by running Oracle on EC2. So if you need full encryption at rest, we can provide that at AWS via KMS. Does not require the advanced security option, transparent data encryption, or any of the other aspects from Oracle. For customers that do like to use transparent data encryption, that is available on RDS Oracle Enterprise Edition, should you still need that. The next area customers have shared with us that was preventing them from moving to standard edition or reducing the edition has to do with the manageability associated with Enterprise Edition. AWS provides lots of manageability for your Oracle infrastructure. There's server information, which is available via CloudWatch. If you're not familiar, CloudWatch collects and monitors your operational data in the form of logs and metrics and events. It can be visualized via an automated dashboard and also can be pushed out to third-party management tools as well. RDS Enhanced Monitoring gives you deeper visibility into the health of your RDS instance in real time. Provides a comprehensive set of system metrics and aggregated processes and information for your instance. And the granularity is up to 1 second or down to 1 second. You can visualize those metrics via the RDS console and also push it out through CloudWatch. That's at the infrastructure level. Then as you move up into the database level, you can run something called Performance Insights for database performance tuning and additional monitoring features. Performance Insights is a very interesting capability, so I figure we'll take another slide to talk a little bit more about that. So Performance Insights allows you to measure database load over time by providing up to 7 days of free performance history. It's very easy to track down and solve a wide variety of products. If you are a Oracle DBA, you'll be familiar with capabilities like Top SQL, Top Session, Weight Statistics. All of these are pushed out through Performance Insights. So it's easy to identify bottlenecks. Performance Insight is also very lightweight. You use a very lightweight connection method, so it will not have much, if any, impact on your application or your production databases. It's very easy to get started. Just log on to your RDS Management Console and enable Performance Insights when you create or modify an instance. The next thing, and Nick covered this a little bit, has to do with right-sizing your instances. Many customers on-premise run their production databases at a really low percentage, maybe maximum 10%, 20%, 30%. With the ease and elasticity of the cloud, many customers are more comfortable running at a higher percentage. Also, there's newer and faster hardware that becomes available at all times. So the first thing you want to do is understand how busy your database is. If you're using Standard Edition, you can use something called Stats Pack, or if you're not licensed for the Oracle Diagnostics Pack, Stats Pack can be run and can give you information about how busy your server is, as well as their operating system commands for Linux and other hardware, other operating systems that can tell you what is the maximum CPU or maximum memory that system is running. If you do run Enterprise Edition and are licensed for the Diagnostics Pack, the easiest way to do this is to run AWR, the Automatic Workload Repository, and run it at 10-minute intervals over a 7-day period, if you can. The longer you can run it, the more accurate the measurements would be. That way you're able to see the average CPU utilization, but also spikes that can then be leveraged for right-sizing it. All of these are done to help you right-size and find how your workload is currently working so you can choose the right workload for your database when moving it over to AWS. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different databases, or different EC2 and RDS instances. For example, there's the R5, which is the next generation of memory optimized instances. There's another instance called the Z1D, which is both high compute and high performance with a core frequency up to 4 gigahertz. So you can run more jobs per core in your single threaded applications. And then the X1E has the highest memory to CPU ratio. If you have an application that is more memory dependent than CPU, having the ability to run more memory is not a license impact, since Oracle licenses just by the physical or virtual core that you're using. So by leveraging an instance that has higher memory, if your application can take advantage of that memory, you can lower the number of CPUs or licenses that you may have to run. So some best practices when it comes to choosing the right hardware. First, check to see if there's newer instances that are available. AWS and RDS often release something called What's New, and there will be new instances being announced, not just at our big conferences, but we also announce them very periodically. And there may be a new instance type that fits your database workload even better, allowing you to really right-size your database application. Many times, the newer instances that come out give you same or even better performance at the same or often lower cost. For example, the R5s versus the R4s. You have an opportunity to run the R5s, which have the newer technology associated with it, at a very similar price. And use RDS on our EBS storage. It's easy to change instance types. By keeping the data on our Elastic Block Storage, you can unattach and reattach a new instance type in a short amount of time. So it's much easier to move between instances, and once you make a choice, it is absolutely a two-way door. You can move from different instance classes and finding the right instance for your right workloads. Another feature I want to talk about is called the Optimized CPU feature. So with this, customers now have the added flexibility of specifying a custom number of vCPUs for a new instance, while having the same amount of memory, storage, and bandwidth associated with it. So instead of moving up to a higher instance size because you needed the memory or the CPU or the networking associated with it, you can run that larger instance, but with a reduced number of CPUs, lowering the licensing impact associated with that. As Nick talked about, there's a different licensing metric if you have hyperthreading turned on or hyperthreading turned off. So if your application doesn't need that hyperthreading, you can turn hyperthreading off. So with that, I will turn it back over to Nick for a little bit more straight talk on optimizing CPUs and how to limit Oracle licenses on AWS.
Thank you, Clancy. The optimized CPU feature that Quincy was just describing is a very key feature if you want to deploy Oracle workloads into AWS EC2 or RDS in a way that is extremely license effective. It is using that feature that House of Brick is often able to help our clients migrate into AWS while simultaneously keeping their net license expenditure the same or even potentially lowering it. But House of Brick also has extensive experience helping clients with Oracle audits, so I want to speak a little bit about the kind of things we've heard about this in Oracle audits. I want to just give you guys the straight, unvarnished information. For many, many years, it's been possible, even in on-premises and physical server environments, to go into your BIOS or UEFI and disable physical processor cores or entire processor sockets on your motherboard. And many people that House of Brick has dealt with have been doing this for years in order to right-size their servers for Oracle licensing purposes. And for just as many years, we keep seeing cases in Oracle audits where Oracle auditors will insist that disabled processors or disabled processor cores are still present in the machine and thus must be licensed. We have not yet had an opportunity to participate in an Oracle audit where there was a lot of scrutiny over the AWS optimized CPU feature, but we have a strong suspicion that it will be treated the same way. The good news for anybody worried about that is that it is a very defensible position in audit, and House of Brick has an excellent track record helping clients deflect such claims from Oracle that disabled processors still need to be licensed, because a disabled processor is not one that Oracle can be installed and or running on, as the contractual documents suggest. The cloud policy is not non-contractual, but as we said, we have seen no hesitation from Oracle to apply it evenly and fairly during audits. So we're not concerned that reliance on it is going to create a position that is ugly for our customers in an audit circumstance. It is subject to change, so make sure that the cloud policy, it might even be worth your time to download and save a copy so that when you are arguing with auditors later, or if you are in the unfortunate position of arguing with software licensing auditors later, you can point to the cloud policy and say, this is the policy that was in effect on the day we purchased and or deployed these licenses. This is the one that should be governing. Obviously, again, check with your legal on that. And make sure you have good records, and this is important in any contractual dispute, of course. Make sure you have good records of how you deployed things, which policies, and what your licensing calculations were. It just makes everything easier later if you get into an argument with Oracle over this stuff during a license audit. Now let's talk about just some of the common risks and pitfalls that we've seen customers, our House of Brick customers, fall into when moving their licenses to a public cloud environment. The first thing that we see people run into, and I've already spoke about them a little bit, but I'll give it a little bit fuller treatment now, is the unlimited license agreement or unlimited license amendment, the so-called ULA. This is a deal that some people have with Oracle that allows them, for a certain list of Oracle products, to have an unlimited deployment right. So they don't have to count cores. They're allowed to use as many as they want, or in the cloud, as many vCPUs as they want. And that sounds great. It sounds like it would be no problem whatsoever. However, do check your ULA and read the fine print. There's a couple things that'll get you in there. In a ULA, there's generally a time limit. Typically 3 years, but we've seen other terms with some of our customers. And at the end of that term, the ULA expires, and of course Oracle will want to renegotiate an extension with you and a new one. But if you choose not to renew that because of the costs or whatever other organizational factors, then a process called certification happens, where you count the number of Oracle licenses by the processor metric. that you are running, and your unlimited agreement converts into a fixed number of processor licenses. Now that can be a good thing, but watch out. The certification process counts all systems where Oracle is installed and running, not installed or running. So on certification day, at the end of your ULA, if you have an Oracle software installed somewhere but it's not online, you don't get a license for it. The other thing is that, again, depending on how old your ULA amendment is to your contracts with Oracle, more recent versions that House of Brick have seen have said that deployments inside AWS don't count for certification, which can potentially create an ugly trap where a shop with a ULA deploys extensive Oracle workloads into AWS, reaches certification date, and then discovers that all of those workloads are suddenly unlicensed, unauthorized workloads, and they're in software licensing trouble with Oracle. The other thing we see people do is, because the certification process is a little bit, it's not really rigorous, I should say. Oracle is not looking over your shoulder to ensure every system that you said had an Oracle product is actually there. They're not connecting to it and validating what's installed or anything like that. They just give you basically a spreadsheet and say, fill out the list. How many systems are running Oracle on certification day, and we'll give you that many licenses. However, it puts you in a very precarious legal position if you are to over-certify. Just start saying, I'm not entirely sure, and it's a lot of difficulty to figure out, so I'm just going to list all of these servers in this environment, all of these EC2 virtual machines, all of these, they probably have Oracle. Because if the certification is challenged later and found to be fraudulent, then it obviously creates a whole mess of issues between your shop and Oracle that one would want to avoid. The next thing to watch out for here is terminating support. Again, this is a very attractive proposition for companies that are taking advantage of the non-Oracle, the open source database engines as they transition workloads into AWS. And maybe, this is very common, here's a hypothetical that is in line with what we've seen in a lot of our clients. Maybe there's 20 databases on day one of moving into the cloud, and they're all Oracle databases, but there's a desire to escape some of these expensive Oracle licenses, so a year later there's 10 Oracle databases and some number of open source databases, and 2 years after that it's down to 5. It dwindles over time. The problem with that is that Oracle has a rule in their licenses called license sets, and this is a rule that generally makes sense, and Oracle has it for a good reason. The license set rule evolved because there used to be a problem where people would purchase 20 databases worth of licensing from Oracle and then cancel support on 19 of them a year later, and then anytime they wanted to call support for help, they would say, oh, this issue is from the one license database, we swear. And like many things in this world, a few bad actors can ruin things for everyone. So in this particular case, Oracle started saying, okay, you can either de-support all your database licenses, and you keep the licenses because you paid for them, or if you de-support a portion of your licenses, you've got to cancel them. There's no more running unlicensed and having, there's no more running licensed but unsupported if you still have some licenses under support, because then you could be abusing our support processes. So if you're trying to wind down your Oracle entitlement over time, you have to be very careful about how you release licenses so that you're not accidentally canceling licenses that you're actively using and creating a situation that will be very bad for you in an Oracle audit. The cloud policy is the other thing we tell people to keep a close eye on. And I've already touched on this several times, but the subject to change at any time at Oracle's discretion portion of that is the part that makes House of Brick nervous. It's a pretty straightforward policy with some reasonable rules for applying Oracle licenses into the AWS cloud. No issue with any of that. The fact that they can and have just flat out changed it in some ways that have dramatically increased the number of licenses required has been a problem for some of our customers. So we do encourage people to keep a record of the cloud policy as the way it was when they adopted use of it, and to check with their legal team or legal counsel to make sure that they are not taking an undue risk in being reliant on it. If it's just a few databases, it's not a huge risk. But if you're planning this as a strategy for your entire enterprise and you have a heavy reliance on Oracle software products, it's worth the time to do a little bit of due diligence with it. And the other thing, and this is actually not new in AWS, this has been a problem in Oracle for years and years. One of the most common ways that we see our customers get into Oracle licensing trouble is unlicensed Enterprise Edition feature usage. And that's that options and packs stuff I was talking about earlier. I'll give some examples. I think Kwesi already mentioned one, the diagnostic and tuning options around the AWR reports. There's also advanced security, advanced compression, lots of other options and packs. When you install Oracle Enterprise Edition, all of those additional options are installed and enabled. And with most of them, there is no way to disable them in modern versions of Oracle. So they're kind of like a minefield of features that are there, they're usable, but the moment you use them for the first time, you owe Oracle a license for them. So having some sort of regular monitoring around which features are in use and which features may have accidentally been used can prevent a lot of licensing trouble. That's actually a common enough problem. The House of Brick has actually developed tooling to help people discover unintended or accidental Oracle feature usage and alarm on it or prevent it. So big problem there potentially. Now let's talk about Oracle audits, because all of this stuff around Oracle licensing revolves around audits. Audits are what you don't want to go into unprepared, because that can be a very expensive situation. An Oracle audit is serious. If you receive an Oracle audit notice, you potentially could be stuck with a big bill if they have any negative findings against you. So it's not something that should just be, whatever, don't worry about it. It's just another software audit. I'll just answer a few questions and they'll tell me everything's fine. It doesn't work like that. The right way to do an Oracle audit so you don't get exposed to any excess liability is first to be prepared before one happens. If you do this, you can make your life during an audit so much easier. So have some documented licensing principles, educate your staff on them, do some internal validation and compliance checks, have a compliance framework, document what you're using, and then communicate all these policies to all of your technical and managerial staff that might touch an Oracle product, so that there's no overuse, no unintended or accidental use. And this is especially important, I would say, in an AWS environment because of the wonderful elasticity and flexibility of a cloud environment. It's so easy to just go say, oh, somebody called me and said this EC2 instance is running a little slow, so I'll just double the number of virtual CPUs. And with just a few clicks and a few minutes, you totally can do that. The problem is, what if there was Oracle software licensed by vCPU on that system? Somebody just doubled your licensing liability with a few clicks and a few minutes. So that's why this is very important, to have controls in place for this stuff prior to being audited. If you do actually get audit notices from Oracle about your Oracle usage, potentially in AWS, it's important to take it seriously and be prepared immediately to say, okay, we need a team of people dealing with this, not a full-time team, but all of these groups need to be in the loop. You need to have technical, which is what most people understand immediately. Technical staff will be handling an audit. But you also need procurement and legal, and I would highly advise you to bring in an outside consultant experienced with Oracle audits to help guide you around some of the pitfalls and help you present the information to Oracle in a way that doesn't spark debates or arguments or things like that. The next thing to keep in mind is that occasionally Oracle auditors will be not quite as up on the licensing rules as they should be. And that's understandable. They're only human. This is a very complex field. We have definitely at House of Brick seen scenarios where Oracle has, during an audit, the auditors have just misapplied a licensing rule, and when gently corrected and pointed to the relevant documents that are binding, that solves that problem. But if you don't have a team that can help you with that and you're not validating everything Oracle says against the correct documentation, it's very easy to just go along with them. And then suddenly at the end, because they've misapplied a licensing rule, they're sticking you with a bill for an extra $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. We've definitely seen mistakes, just pure accidental human error mistakes on Oracle auditors' part, leading to six-figure differences in the amount of money they're trying to capture at the end of an Oracle audit to true up the licenses appropriately. The next thing to do is document. As with any process that there's a lot of dollars or potentially legal implications, it is best to deal with Oracle in a way where there's a record. Don't just hop on the phone and have a one-to-one call. Too easy for two different people to walk away from that conversation with two different understandings, and then you're in that ugly game of he said, she said later, as two people are remembering the same conversation differently. Deal with them by email. Have full documentation of what you've communicated to them, and have good documentation on what your Oracle installation position is, what your Oracle licensing position is. Have all your ducks in a row. And then if you communicate with them carefully, as I suggested, preferentially by email, preferentially with data that you've correctly validated, even if it's an Oracle provided tool, that they say run this and it will gather information. You can certainly review the output files first and get ahead of the game by noting right up front, this has a bad result in it, or this listed this server that we know is offline, or something like that. Because sometimes the Oracle automated tools for information discovery make mistakes as well. They're not perfect, they have bugs, very understandable. If you follow all these processes through, you should find the Oracle audit to be relatively painless, and you won't be getting any surprise bills at the end. And that's really the goal that we're trying to help all our clients with, to use Oracle technologies effectively, especially in AWS, without getting in trouble on Oracle's licensing or audit practices. Now, if you've enjoyed all this content we've provided, there's a couple places you can go for more. I'm going to list a few right here. House of Brick obviously has a great blog where we talk about all sorts of Oracle licensing or Oracle technical topics, many of them related to AWS. You can also engage us for just a one-day consultation if you just need to review principles or brainstorm or educate your staff on certain topics. If you're looking to move to the cloud and you want to have a plan in place so you know that there's not going to be any technical or licensing traps waiting for you, we have a readiness assessment service that a lot of people find very useful to have us just come in for a short period and help you plan your cloud architecture. And then, of course, if you want to actually technically try it, prove that you're getting the performance you need, the costs you need, and the license footprint you need, we're happy to help with proof of concept or pilot exercises as well. To find out anything more about any of these RDS features we've talked about, of course, you can contact your AWS representative. And for some of these House of Brick specific services, if they sound like they'd be of interest to you, obviously you can contact House of Brick as well. I think that concludes our session today. So thank you for everybody who made it this far. Kwesi, any parting words?
Thank you, everybody. And if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us directly or to your AWS account manager.
All right. Thank you, everybody.